Welcome back to Outside Views, and today we're going to look at the most exhausting self-inflicted wound in modern political history and ask the question that everyone is whispering, but few are brave enough to answer. How on earth does Britain get back into the European Union? It's January 2026, and as we look around at a world that is fragmenting into massive protective trading blocs, the idea of global Britain looks less like a bold new frontier and more like a lonely life raft leaking air in the middle of the Atlantic. And my personal view is that we have reached the end of the road for the great Brexit delusion, and the only question remaining is not if the UK returns, but when the political class will find the courage to admit they were wrong. And the outside views from where I sit is that the British are famously indecisive about Europe, having spent the last 80 years flip-flopping between leading the continent and running away from it. If you look back to 1945, Britain was at the heart of creating European alliances, yet they refused to join the first European coal and steel community, settling for mere association agreement because they felt they were too big for the club. Then came Harold Macmillan in 1961, a Tory who realized the mistake and applied for membership, only to be humiliated and rebuffed by Charles de Gaulle's famous "non." And it took another decade and Edward Heath's Conservative government to finally drag the UK into the fold in 1973, only for the Labour Party to immediately pivot toward opposition. We saw the first referendum in 1975, where the British people voted by a massive two-thirds majority to stay in, yet the dithering never truly stopped. Margaret Thatcher fought for her money back, then helped build the very single market that the current generation of politicians has so recklessly abandoned. Tony Blair ditched some opt-outs but kept others, and David Cameron eventually lost his gamble with the 2016 referendum that plunged the country into this decade-long nightmare. And this historical pattern is clear. Britain spends half its time trying to get in, and the other half trying to get out. And in 2026, we are precisely at the point where the tide is turning back towards in. And my strong personal view is that Keir Starmer's current reset of relations with the EU is a weak, uninspiring piece of political theatre that is failing to address the fundamental economic reality of the country, even though it's the only thing he can do at the moment, with his kind of bravery. He spent his first year in office traveling around Europe being amiable, but amiability doesn't fix a 4% drop in long-term productivity or a 15% collapse in global trade volume. The trade and cooperation agreement that Boris Johnson signed is a minimalistic, frustrating mess that Starmer is currently tinkering with at the edges. Ministers are spending thousands of hours trying to negotiate minor veterinary agreements or data adequacy rules, but it's like trying to fix a shattered window with a piece of scotch tape. And the EU, quite rightly, has other priorities, like the war in Ukraine and its own internal productivity crisis, and they have no interest in letting Britain cherry-pick its way back into the benefits of the club without paying the dues. However, I believe the geopolitical necessity is about to force a massive U-turn that will make Harold Macmillan's 1961 pivot look like a minor adjustment. The re-election of Donald Trump in late 2024 and his subsequent tariff blunderbuss approach throughout 2025 and still ongoing has left Britain in a terrifying position. With Washington firing off trade threats in every direction, the hope of a special US-UK trade deal has evaporated into thin air, and I mean something important, not what they did there, leaving the UK squeezed between two giants. And when Trump threatens a global tariff war, Britain realizes it's a medium-sized island parked right next to a regulatory superpower that it used to lead. And the outside view is that the return of Trump has fundamentally recalibrated British interests, making the protection of the European single market look like a vital survival strategy rather than a bureaucratic choice. And furthermore, the passage of Ukraine toward EU membership is reviving the European vocation in the UK, as people realize they are missing out on the most significant security and economic reorganization of the century. And just not forget, in 2027, there will be a referendum on Iceland to join the EU. Just heard that yesterday. And I find it absurd that Starmer continues to rule out a customs union or the single market when every independent economic indicator shows that the UK is lagging behind the rest of the G7. And the Office for Budget Responsibility has confirmed that the current path is a dead end, with investment intensity routinely sitting at the bottom of the OECD rankings. British business is crying out for a return to an assured regulatory framework because the Brussels effect is still the reality for any company that wants to export. Brexit forced the UK to create its own underpowered, under-resourced regulators to replace the authority of the European Commission, and the result has been more red tape and not less. And I believe that by late 2026, the frustration of fiddling at the margins will become so great that Starmer will be forced to push and publish a major white paper outlining the terms for reversing Brexit. But I always tell you, this has to be played with honesty. And the most important part of honesty here is Brexit can never be reversed. You can repair a lot of damages, but even if the UK were to join the EU again, that would look very different to the membership they had. But this wouldn't just be about trade. It would be about joining more than 30 EU executive agencies and technical networks that the UK should have never left. Think about the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, which used to be part of the European Medicines Agency, or the European Investment Bank, which the UK has lost £44 billion in investment from since 2017. A return to the EU would mean re-entering the customs union and the single market, which would immediately solve the rules of origin nightmares and the border delays that are killing small businesses. It would also mean embracing the indivisibility of the four freedoms: goods, yes, people, services, and capital. And my personal view is that the British public is finally ready for this, as the Take Back Control slogan has been revealed as a hollow promise that only delivered higher prices and lower standards. And even the migration argument has flipped. Since Brexit, net inward migration has actually shifted toward non-Europeans, proving that stopping EU citizens didn't solve the underlying labor demands of the economy. The UK would have to join on the basis of equality, meaning no more special Cameron or Thatcher-style opt-outs from the ever-closer union mission. The British will have to drop their traditional opposition to deeper integration and prove that they can be stable and reliable partners rather than constant dissenters. This means accepting the oversight of the European Court of Justice and treating economic policy as a matter of common concern with the rest of the bloc. And while joining the euro is a conversation for a much later date, but still a prerequisite for joining, a new member would have to formally commit to the goals of economic and monetary union, and once they fulfill the criteria, they would have to join the euro. The how of this process would likely involve a formal application under Article 49 of the Treaty on the European Union, followed by a transition period that could last several years. I made videos on all the 35 chapters that they have to pass there. And of course, they have to fulfill the Copenhagen criteria to be a candidate, and they do not at the moment. But I suspect that another referendum would be necessary after the next general election to ensure that the settlement of Europe's British problem is finally enduring and bipartisan. But it would be much, much better if a party would run with their manifesto on that topic, and not the Liberals or the Greens. It would need to be the Labour Party as the biggest party on their side to do that. then we would get a clear answer. If running on that manifesto, Labour, after everything we're seeing at the moment, would then get a big majority. That would be a sign. But the tragedy of the last 10 years is that the UK has been a resource colony for the EU, sending electricity and data through cables, but having no say in the high-value manufacturing and lawmaking that happens in Brussels. British ministers and MEPs needs to be back at the heart of the decision-making process to ensure a liberal, pro-innovation approach to things like artificial intelligence and the digital market rules. And yes, that would even mean that the EU would have to deal with reform MEPs again, like they did with Nigel Farage once more. But yeah, I will not talk about the unanimous vote of the 27 that are member right now that would have to allow all this. That's a topic for another day. But the City of London has so far survived Brexit, but it's currently a global finance center without a continental home, and joining again would expand the capital pool available to it. Plus, the transition period that is still running for Euro clearance, that is another major blow to the city. When that ends, we will talk about the global financial center again. And musicians, students and scientists are all suffering under the current restrictions on movement, and their reintegration into programs like Erasmus Plus and Horizon in the full version would be a massive boost for the UK's soft power. And the outside view is that the EU itself is smaller, weaker and poorer without the British. And there is a gap in European politics that only the UK can fill, especially regarding common security and defence policy. And despite that Brexiteers always claim that I'm bashing the UK all day, no, I am not. I'm stating facts here. And the fact is that the UK is not doing well with Brexit. Brexit was a major mistake. And I would have preferred to never see this, although this can be a big healing thing if they return, when they return, that they realize this was never a good idea. And of course, I'm telling you the truth about the feelings from the EU side about the treatment they got from Britain in the last 10 years. There will not be a big party when Britain applies again. Although, objectively, it would be good for both sides if they would join again. But after all that happened in the last decade, there wouldn't be a big celebration over that. And, as I said, all 27 member states would have to allow that. But I think the time for tinkering is over, and the time for a bold historical U-turn is here. The British are masters of the U-turn, having done it in 1961, 1967, 1970 and 1997. And every day spent outside that single market is a day of lost growth and diminishing influence in a world that is becoming more dangerous by the hour. Nationalism must finally be outweighed by economic facts and geopolitical necessity. And we are watching the slow motion realization that sovereignty doesn't mean much if you are poor and isolated. The road back will be long, and it will require the UK to drop its arrogant exceptionalism and learn how to be a team player again. But the alternative is a slow slide into irrelevance as a little Britain, and as a little Britain that used to matter, but chose to walk away from its destiny. I believe that by 2027 the debate will no longer be about if they rejoin, but about how quickly the EU will have them back. And that is the point with the Copenhagen criteria and the 35 chapters. Don't forget that one. The reset is just the first timid step of a long journey home. It's time to admit that the Brexit experiment has failed, and it's time to start the process of fixing it for the next generation. The prodigal son of Europe is finally looking at the pigsty he created and realizing that his father's house was a much better place to be. And the only thing standing in the way is the pride of a few politicians who are too scared to tell the truth. But the truth has a way of coming out eventually, and the truth of 2026 is that Britain needs Europe just tenfold as Europe needs Britain. So let's stop the dithering, stop the tinkering, and start the re-entry. This will take a very, very long time and a lot of repairing of trust, by the way. But stop that BS and start telling everyone the truth. And I mean Starmer. I wouldn't even try to make Farage tell the truth. That will never happen. But I also mean the Rejoin party that was formed and the whole Rejoin campaign that is out there. Tell the people the truth. Membership is absolutely necessary for the UK. But membership would be very different for the UK than the membership they once had. You need to tell the truth in your campaigns as well. We had enough lies in 2016 and we don't need lies in the future in the campaigns once more. And tell the people how long that road still would be if it was started today, because of the Copenhagen criteria, because of the unanimous vote required by the EU 27, which means trust building in the first place, plus the 35 chapters of joining the EU. Tell the people the truth.